In generation-spanning stories, for one to establish a family legacy, they must factor in the first person that the audience is most likely introduced to from that family, as they tend to leave the longest-lasting impact that shape how people will view their descendants or ancestors going forward. A great example of this is Jonathan Joestar of Phantom Blood, as Araki specifically wrote him as a heroic and altruistic soul, so that when we would meet the colder or crueler Joestars that he had planned for the future, we would know deep down that they have the blood of a hero within them and will make the right decision. Though a legacy can do more than establish a general tone for the person, but it can also imply an expected talent in their role. And in the case of the vampire-slaying Belmonts of Castlevania, the first characters audiences are introduced to is a man who embodies the practice of slaying the knight. This being the brutish barbarian blasting beast and boldly bulldozing Bram Stoker's bastard, Simon Belmont, the vampire killer. Simon Belmont is the debut protagonist and one of the mascots for the Castlevania series, appearing for the first time in the original Castlevania all the way back in 1986, and he would go on to get his own sequel game in the form of Simon's Quest. Both of his mainline appearances feature his direct conflict with the Dark Lord Dracula, and with the Belmont family's treasured whip in hand and the stories of his ancestors fueling him, Simon becomes the ultimate bane for the dark, even eventually going on to tie series veteran and Dampire Alucard for the most Dracula kills in the series. And doing so all the while being entirely human. Though before we get too deep into that, let's understand the meaning behind his name and design. Now, Simon Belmont's name is pretty important for the game's legacy, as he is the first instance of the Belmont family name in the series, and thus, when you see someone named Belmont before or after him in the timeline, you have a pretty strong image of what they'll already be like, though the name itself actually has a pretty interesting developmental history, as in the early planning stages of the original Castlevania, Simon actually went by the name Peter Dante, with the Dante portion of the name obviously being in reference to Dante Alighieri of Divine Comedy fame, as Peter Dante's story is about how he descends deeper and deeper into the Hell Castle Castlevania, similar to how the Divine Comedy is about Dante descending through the 9 circles of hell. Also, a cool detail kept and reused in a future entry is that Peter Dante was the grandson of Christopher Dante, which is likely what went on to inspire the protagonist name of Castlevania Adventures, and its lead, Christopher Belmont, though the first name of Peter likely also inspired the name for our protagonist now, this being Simon, as a lot of the Belmonts are named after religious themes, with Simon coming from Simon Peter, also known as Saint Peter, the first pope, which is similar to Simon's role as the first Belmont, even though in the timeline he isn't actually the first, he's just the first one that players got to experience. Though his family name of Dante would be changed to Belmont or Belmondo in Japanese, likely in reference to the French movie star Jean-Paul Belmondo, as developers wanted Simon to have a strong European-sounding name, given that the game was set in Transylvania. And at the time, Belmondo had become extremely popular internationally, especially beloved in Japan, even going on to inspire other famous characters' names of the time, like the Jean and Jean-Pierre Polnareff from Stardust Crusaders fame was inspired by Belmondo. As well, the actor went on to inspire the visuals of Arsène Lupin from Lupin III fame. Though, speaking of designs, Simon Belmont has gone through quite a few over the years, with his original being his most iconic, and that being the barbarian-like design, which appears to be the decided factor of his standard appearance in anything going forward, as he appears as such in Grimoire of the Souls and in Smash Bros. Now, this design appears to be directly inspired by the film Conan the Barbarian, as the whole of Castlevania is drenched in Western film references, with Simon's use of a whip even being directly inspired by the Indiana Jones films. Now, this type of design was clearly chosen so that Simon would have a powerful profile in order to sell the players on his ability, with even the original box art of the game taking direct influence from the works of Frank Frazetta and his 1972 painting, The Norseman. Though, as the Castlevania series evolved and the artists changed, we got to see a lot of reinterpretation of Simon's own classic design, like the beautiful and stunning gothic Vishonen style of Ayami Kojima, which, after experimenting with a couple of different color palettes for Simon, decided to give him a red and black theme, likely based on the armor he would go on to wear in the sequel game, or in the case of Castlevania Judgements, where they brought in guest artist Tokishi Obata of Death Note fame to redo the classic design in his style, and his version of Simon went for that "this is literally just like Yagami again from Death Note, but Misa picked out his outfit" look. This design would even go on to be reimagined in the Castlevania reboot series, The Lords of Shadow, as while Simon is an entirely different character in that reboot, Mercury Stream claims that they originally wanted to make a game in the style of the original, with Simon as its lead, before being given the green light to go full ham with their own original story. Though their design of Simon appears to be done in a way of staying in line with his roots in history, adopting that Kojima-esque red theme for the character, but in the Lords of Shadows flavor, creating this savage barbarian look for Simon, though to me he kinda came out looking a little bit more like Akuma from the Street Fighter series than Simon Belmont. Though his classic design also helps sell his skills as a hunter, with a specific set of his skills going on to become a standard expectation in every Belmont in the series going forward. Something far beyond his family's legendary alchemical whip, the Vampire Killer, this being his usage of sub-weapons. Sub-weapons are tools found throughout the game, and they would go on to be staples in the series going forward, even in the Metroidvania-style games, with each entry either adding a new one or a different mechanic involving them, always improving on the system, but Simon helped lay a solid foundation for the mechanic, as his set of sub-weapons are the go-to for any person looking to hunt the night, from daggers, axes, crosses, holy water, to even a stopwatch that can freeze time. All of these tools fueled by hearts that he collects throughout the level, which I've always thought was a weird decision, but I imagine the intention behind it is that the hearts are supposed to represent the character's willpower, as you need a strong will to enchant these sub-weapons in order to have them hurt creatures of the darkness, or else they would just bounce off. It is just a hand axe, but a holy hand axe is something different. But the reason that he doesn't need that for the whip is that the whip comes pre-enchanted. That's how it's always worked. Though what makes this ammunition cost for the sub-weapons worth it, well, they provide Simon a lot of versatility in his moveset. For example, the axe is thrown in an upward arcing pattern, which strikes enemies from above with ease and can make the first boss of the game a bit of a joke, while something like Holy Water does a similar thing, but it's a lower arc, allowing Simon to more easily hit things below him. As well, it leaves a small fireball on the ground that lasts a few moments for some extra damage, with future entries of the series having the Holy Water sort of shoot out a wave of fire. As well, the stopwatch allows Simon to briefly enter Dio's world within the frozen time, and with his strength of heart, sub-weapons at his side, and Vampire Killer guiding him all the way, Simon was able to overcome the forces of darkness and slay not only the Dark Lord's most loyal servants like Medusa and Death, but Dracula himself, and brought the Devil Castle crumbling to rubble. Though this wouldn't be the only interaction that Simon would have with the Dark Lord, as 7 years later, during the events of Simon Quest, he would pick up his whip and hunt the night again. But what a terrible night for a curse, as due to his battle with Dracula in Castlevania 1, the Dark Lord was able to inflict cursed wounds onto Simon that would slowly drain him of his strength, stamina, and vitality over the coming years, leaving the man weakened and sick. Though, for those long 7 years, Simon was unaware of the exact reasoning behind his condition. He only assumed that death was slowly coming for him, and thus, he went to confide in his ancestors at the Belmont family grave, and it was here that he was confronted by a mysterious woman who appeared within the fog and told him of Dracula's curse. That woman likely being the spirit of the family whip, and the late fiancé of the Belmont who started his rivalry with the Dark Lord, that being Sarah. With this knowledge of his curse in mind, Simon began his quest to revive the Dark Lord in order to sever the curse and then end Dracula once and for all. Though due to his strength waning over the years, he decided to don a suit of armor to protect himself, as well as a bodysuit to hide his cursed figure from the world. And after tracking down the parts of Dracula, staking them to remove their power, and then finally bringing them to the ruins of his castle, the Dark Lord was once again revived. But this resurrection wouldn't last too long, as the final battle between him and Simon began, with Simon destroying Dracula completely and freeing him of the curse. And with his life force restored and his spirit cleansed, he continued the Belmont legacy and raised a family that would continue his work. But what makes these two events so impressive is that in later games lore, it would be established that Simon's strength is all naturally built. he trained to an insane degree and dedicated his entire life to his routine, which was relatively shocking and partly scary for modern vampire hunters to witness. He was an intense man who tended to take matters involving the Belmonts very seriously, but he was also rather accepting of anyone who volunteered to hunt the night on their own, be them young, old, vampire, or whatever. As well, Simon possesses little to no knowledge about magic or the accursed, but the Belnades clan's magic still does run through his veins, and would go on to be passed down to his grandson. Though Simon's legacy has had more of an impact on the series outside of just the lore elements of it. He has seemingly been impactful, or at least an inspiration for every game in the series going forward outside of the 3D ones. From the writing of future characters like Richter Belmont, who in a way is a reimagining of Simon's story, with them both being uniquely powerful vampire hunters who single-handedly crush Dracula's forces, and are cursed in some way during their maiden venture into Castlevania. With Simon, he is cursed by Dracula, and Richter is cursed by the Dark Wizard Shaft. And of course, they both work to revive the Dark Lord at some point to fight against him again, with Richter doing so underneath a hypnotic suggestion and ending up cursing the Belmont clan, while when Simon did it, he cleansed himself and his family's bloodline. Though Simon also lays out the foundation for both styles of Castlevania games, be it the classic platforming action-adventure games with his first one, that would go on to be perfected in entries like Rondo of Blood, which is yet again another connection between him and Richter, but you could also argue that Simon could be considered the inspiration behind the more beloved style, that being the Metroidvania style of the games made popular by Symphony of the Night and Aria of Sorrow. He did so with his second adventure in Simon's Quest, as even though the reception to Simon's Quest was, well...
This game sucks. Castlevania 1 and 3 are great classic Nintendo games, but for Castlevania 2, Simon's Quest, the game designers obviously were not thinking straight.
It was developed with a focus on secret areas and hidden treasure scattered throughout the game that you needed to collect and use in specific ways to access other areas, which is an aspect of game design that would go on to become staples in Metroidvania titles, and with refinement became beloved. He was even the character they used to debut a bunch of special whipping mechanics in the remake/reimagining of Castlevania 1 called Super Castlevania 4. These updated mechanics would partly become commonplace in usage in future titles that had whips, though the cool detail about this sort of new mechanic is that diagonal whipping was always intended to be in the series since the first game, as design docs for the original Castlevania 1 show off this concept, though, likely due to the restrictions of the hardware at the time, the feature was cut. Also, it was likely done to sort of favor the sub-weapons as being more vital to the player at the time. But beyond just inspiring games, Simon would go on to act as sort of Castlevania's representation and mascot for cameos and crossovers in other games, usually being Konami-focused, like his small appearance in the second Goemon Gaiden story, or his reference in Contra Headcorp, to him even being a playable fighter in things like DreamHack's TV World Fighters, and of course Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, but more importantly, he shreds the night in Evolution Skateboarding. At the end of the day, Simon is probably the most important Belmont in the series, being the origin point for trends in the series as well as embodying the legendary nature of the Belmont bloodline. He is also written in a way that made it so both the Belmonts that came before him and the ones who come after could match his strength and legend without ever devaluing his role specifically, as him modeling himself after the stories of Belmonts in the past means that characters like Trevor and Leon can show elements of Simon's character, and it can be assumed that he emulated them. As well, with Simon purifying his bloodline by defeating Dracula twice, his teachings can go on to inspire the skills of future Belmonts like Just and Richter, who end up perfecting his techniques. I can only hope that if Castlevania ever gets another thing like the Netflix animated series, that they would focus on Simon's story in some way. Hopefully he might get referenced once or twice in Castlevania Nocturne. But I won't hold my breath for that. Now, if you enjoyed this video and want to see more videos like it in the future, I have a Patreon at patreon.com/MediNotTheBadGuy. And if you want to help hunt the night and keep vampires away from you, well, you can do so by buying a copy of Shimonetta, A Boring World Where the Concept of Dirty Jokes Doesn't Exist at buyshimonetta.com.